I never thought one simple moment could change the way I saw someone I thought I knew. It started like any ordinary evening, the kind where the silence of our small apartment wrapped around us like a blanket. The hum of the old refrigerator, the distant noise of laughter from the street outside, the flicker of the TV we weren't really watching, everything felt normal, almost too normal. And then, out of nowhere, his eyes landed on the silver ring I had just bought. He leaned closer with that casual confidence he always carried, the kind that made me both jealous and secretly drawn to him, and said with a smirk, "Let me see that." He slid it off my finger without hesitation, and in that instant something shifted, something I couldn't put into words but could feel in my chest like a spark. Living with him had always been a strange balance of comfort and tension. He was the kind of guy people noticed the moment he walked into a room, broad shoulders, careless smile, the life of every party. To everyone else, he was the straight roommate, the one who always had stories about girls, hookups, and Friday night plans. But to me, he was more than that. He was the person who stayed up with me until sunrise when exams drained me, the one who made sure I ate when I skipped meals, the one who knocked on my door just to check if I was okay. There was something in the way he treated me, softer than how he treated others, that always left me wondering. But I never let myself believe it could be more than friendship. I had learned to bury feelings like that deep down, where they couldn't hurt me. That night though, watching him slip the ring onto his hand, my heart thudded in my chest like it wanted to escape. His fingers lingered a little too long, twisting the ring slowly, as if testing how it felt against his skin. I laughed nervously, pretending it was just a joke, just another silly moment between roommates. "Careful, it's not your style," I muttered, trying to sound casual. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me, eyes steady, as if he was searching for something he couldn't name. The air grew heavier. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. He finally slid the ring back onto my finger, his touch brushing against my skin, warm, deliberate, and far too gentle to mean nothing that I told myself I imagined it. That's what I always did. I convinced myself it was all in my head, that I was desperate to see signs where there were none. But later that night, lying awake in the dark, I couldn't forget the way his eyes had held mine or the strange silence that followed. My mind kept replaying it, over and over, like a loop I couldn't escape. And deep inside, buried under fear and denial, a tiny voice whispered, "What if it wasn't just in your head?" The days after weren't the same. He acted normal on the surface, joking around, leaving his socks in the living room, blasting music too loud when he showered, but every now and then, I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't the careless glance of a friend. It was different. Sharper. He seemed to be holding back words he couldn't say, thoughts he couldn't voice. And I was scared. Scared of hoping, scared of losing what we had, scared of finding out that maybe, just maybe, the thing I wanted most was standing right in front of me. One evening, as I sat on the couch fiddling with the ring, he walked past and paused, his hand brushing my shoulder as he leaned over to grab something from the table. That simple touch burned like fire. I froze, and for a second, I thought he lingered there, too close, too intentional. He didn't say anything, just gave me a look that was almost unreadable, then walked away. My chest tightened, my thoughts spun, and I realized something I hadn't dared to admit before, that ring had become more than just a piece of metal. It had become a symbol of everything unspoken between us, every glance, every pause, every word we didn't say. That I sat there alone, staring at it, my heart aching with a mix of fear and longing. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, that ring had unlocked something in him that neither of us could ignore anymore. And though I tried to bury the thought, I couldn't shake the feeling that life in that apartment was never going to be the same again. The days after that strange moment carried a weight I couldn't shake. Everything looked the same, the walls of our apartment, the mess of shoes by the door, the empty pizza boxes we never bothered to throw out, but the air between us was different. He didn't say anything about the ring, didn't mention that pause, that look, or the way his touch lingered. Yet it was there, in the way his eyes seemed to find mine without trying, in the way he sat closer than usual on the couch, in the way his laugh came softer when it was just the two of us. I told myself not to read into it, not to let my mind spin stories that could break me, but my heart wasn't listening. Every tiny thing felt louder, sharper, like it meant something more. That I remember one evening when he came home later than usual, the smell of alcohol clinging to him, his hair a little messy, his steps uneven. He dropped onto the couch beside me with a sigh, rubbing his face with both hands. I asked if he was okay, expecting him to brush it off like he always did. Instead, he leaned his head back against the cushion, eyes half closed, and muttered, "I couldn't stop thinking about that ring." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy. My heart stopped, and I didn't know what to say. I laughed nervously, tried to make light of it, but he didn't join in. He just turned his head slowly toward me, his gaze steady, too serious for someone drunk. His hand reached for mine, fingertips brushing against my knuckles, and for a second, I thought he was going to lace his fingers through mine. But he didn't. He pulled back suddenly, sat upright, and changed the subject as if nothing had happened. I sat frozen, my skin still tingling where he'd touched me, my mind screaming questions I didn't dare ask. The next morning, he acted as though none of it had happened. He made coffee, hummed to himself, joked about the game he watched last night. But his eyes betrayed him. Every time I caught his glance, it carried something unsettled, something unspoken, and I could feel it pressing down on me like a storm building overhead. He asked me strange questions out of nowhere, about love, about relationships, about whether I believed people could change. I answered carefully, trying not to reveal too much, trying not to let him see how much his curiosity rattled me. Deep inside, I wondered if he was testing me, or if he was testing himself. As days turned into weeks, the silence between us grew more meaningful than words. We still laughed, still shared meals, still argued over whose turn it was to clean, but underneath it all was a current we both felt and neither acknowledged. Sometimes he would look at me for just a second too long, and my chest would ache with both hope and fear. Other times he would pull away quickly, as though afraid of what he might do if he stayed too close. The confusion consumed me, leaving me restless at night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every glance, every word, every brush of his hand like it was a secret code I was supposed to decode. One night, we sat side by side at the table, books and papers spread out in front of us. He was pretending to study, though I could tell his mind was elsewhere. I fiddled with the ring again, twisting it nervously around my finger, when suddenly he reached out without a word and slid it off. My breath caught as he examined it slowly, turning it in his hand as though it held some kind of power. Then, almost deliberately, he slid it onto his finger once more. He didn't laugh this time, didn't make a joke about how it looked. He just looked at me, eyes locked on mine, the silence between us heavy and charged. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse racing in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just that moment, just him, just us. After what felt like an eternity, he slipped the ring off and placed it carefully back on my finger, his touch slow, almost tender. Then he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as though shaking himself awake, and mumbled something about being tired. He left the table, left me sitting there with my heart pounding, my hands trembling, and a question burning so fiercely in my mind it hurt. Was I imagining everything, or was he silently confessing something he couldn't yet say out loud? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in around me, the sound of his quiet breathing from the other room echoing in my ears. I wanted so badly to believe there was something real in his actions, that I wasn't just dreaming it all up, that the ring had stirred something in him he didn't know how to name. But the fear of being wrong, of ruining everything, kept me frozen. And so I stayed silent, trapped between the hope that maybe he felt the same and the terror that maybe he never would. The rhythm of our lives carried on, but it felt like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to happen, something neither of us could name. Every ordinary routine seemed touched by an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. When we cooked dinner together, our shoulders brushed in the small kitchen, and instead of laughing it off, there was silence, a silence heavy with awareness. When we sat on the couch, he didn't just throw his legs up carelessly anymore, he angled them toward me, his knee brushing mine like it belonged there. It wasn't only the closeness, it was the way his eyes lingered, the way he seemed to look at me as if I carried some secret he wanted to uncover. The ring had turned into more than an object. It had become the invisible thread tugging us closer, tying our unspoken feelings together. I caught him staring at it when he thought I wasn't looking. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he liked the shine of the metal. But the way his gaze held, the way his lips parted slightly as though he wanted to say something and couldn't, it didn't feel casual. It felt like a silent conversation we weren't brave enough to start. I told myself not to overthink, but my heart wouldn't let it go. The more I noticed his stolen glances, the more I realized how often his hand brushed mine, how often his laugh softened when his eyes met mine, how often he seemed to choose my company over the endless stream of girls who used to circle around him. One late night, we were sitting at the table surrounded by books. The clock ticked past midnight, and the only sound was the scratching of our pens and the faint hum of traffic outside. He leaned back in his chair with a groan, stretching his arms above his head, and then his gaze fell on the ring again. Without asking, without a word, he reached across the table and slid it off my finger. My pulse jumped instantly, my throat dry as I watched him. He turned it over in his hand, studying it as if it held answers to questions he hadn't dared to ask himself. Then, slowly, he slipped it onto his own finger. This time, he didn't laugh or make some sarcastic remark about how it looked. His expression was unreadable, serious, almost heavy, and when his eyes lifted to mine, it felt like the world stopped moving. The room was silent except for our breathing, but that silence was loud enough to drown me. I couldn't move, couldn't even swallow. His gaze locked onto mine, deep and searching, as though he was trying to find something in me, some truth he couldn't yet admit to himself. He didn't look away. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst that I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words stuck in my throat. My hand twitched, longing to reach for his, but fear held me back. Fear of misreading everything. Fear of breaking what we already had. Fear of losing him if I dared to hope too much. And then, just as slowly as he had put it on, he slid the ring off his finger and placed it back in my hand. His fingers brushed against my skin, gentle and deliberate, and the touch burned into me like fire. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, muttering that he was tired, and walked toward his room without another word. That I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the ring resting against my skin, my heart still racing. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a confession neither of us could voice, a boundary we had both crossed without saying so out loud. That moment was too intentional, too charged to dismiss as nothing. I turned it over in my hand again and again, wondering what it meant to him, what he was wrestling with inside. The next few days were filled with these small, silent exchanges that spoke louder than any conversation could. When I passed him a glass, his fingers lingered on mine for a fraction longer than necessary. When we laughed at something stupid, he held my gaze just a little too long after the laughter faded. And when we sat together in the evenings, the space between us felt charged, like it was begging to disappear, like something was waiting to happen if one of us only dared to move first, and yet, the words remained unsaid. I couldn't ask him what he was thinking. He couldn't admit what he was feeling. So we lived in that limbo, suspended in the pull of something both terrifying and magnetic. Every glance, every accidental touch, every silence between us was heavier than before, and I found myself lying awake at night wondering how long we could dance around it before the weight became too much to carry. The tension between us had grown into something I could no longer ignore, and I could feel it bleeding into everything we did. Even the smallest moments carried weight now. A brush of his hand in the kitchen felt like a spark. A glance across the couch felt like a question. And every time he looked at me with that unreadable intensity, I felt myself crumbling inside. I wanted to know what he was thinking, what he was holding back, but I was too afraid to ask. The fear of hearing an answer I didn't want made my chest heavy. It was easier to sit in silence, even if that silence drove me mad, but silence doesn't last forever. It cracks under pressure. And one evening, it finally did. We had been sitting in the living room, the air thick between us after another long day of small, charged moments. I had been avoiding his eyes, pretending to scroll through my phone, when he suddenly asked me why I never wore the ring around anyone else. His voice was casual, but there was something sharp underneath it, like he wasn't just asking about jewelry. I felt my stomach twist. I muttered something vague about it being personal, a gift to myself, something that reminded me of who I was. He didn't let it go. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine, and asked, "Is it because it means more than that?" The question hit me like a blow. My chest tightened, my pulse raced, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I laughed nervously, tried to deflect, but the look on his face told me he wasn't joking. He was pushing, testing, trying to peel back the walls I had built around myself. And I panicked. I snapped at him, defensive, telling him to drop it, that he didn't understand. His expression changed instantly, shifting from curiosity to something harder, something wounded. He snapped back, asking why I was always hiding, why I never trusted him enough to be real with him. The words stung because they were true. He didn't know the battles I fought in silence, the years of hiding, the fear of rejection that clung to me like a shadow. And suddenly, all the tension between us erupted into anger that we argued, not about the ring anymore, but about everything. About the way he left his mess everywhere. About the way I was always too quiet. About things that didn't matter at all but carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. His voice was sharp, mine sharper, and for the first time since we'd met, we weren't laughing or teasing, we were tearing into each other. I hated it, hated the sound of my voice breaking, hated the way his face twisted in frustration, hated how close we were to saying things we couldn't take back. The fight ended abruptly. He shoved himself up from the couch, muttering something under his breath, and stormed into his room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I sat there in the silence that followed, trembling, my chest tight, my hands clenched into fists. My eyes burned, but I refused to let the tears fall. All I could think about was how fast it had all spiraled, how something so small had ripped open everything we had been holding back. And worse than the fight itself was the emptiness it left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the echoes of his words playing in my head. Was he angry because I snapped? Or was he angry because I wouldn't admit what we both felt? I pressed my face into the pillow, trying to drown out the ache in my chest, but it only grew heavier. I had spent so long hiding, so long convincing myself to settle for silence, but now silence felt unbearable. I wanted to go to his room, to knock on his door, to apologize, to tell him everything I had been too afraid to say. But I stayed frozen, paralyzed by the same fear that had always kept me quiet. That in the morning, we barely spoke. He grabbed his keys, mumbled something about class, and left without looking at me. I sat at the table staring at my coffee, feeling the weight of his absence press down on me. The apartment felt colder, emptier, as though the fight had carved a space between us that hadn't been there before. I thought about the ring, about the way it had felt when he slid it onto my finger, about the way his eyes had burned into mine in that silence. I twisted it around and around, my hands shaking, and realized how badly I wanted to bridge the distance. I wanted to stop pretending. I wanted to stop hiding. But I didn't know if he wanted the same, and so, the days stretched on with that same distance between us, every word cautious, every glance guarded. We orbited around each other like two planets caught in the same pull but afraid to collide. And in the quiet of the night, when I lay awake listening to the sound of his footsteps moving across the floor in the next room, I wondered how much longer we could go on like this before something had to give. The night it finally broke was heavy with rain. The sound of it hammered against the windows and filled the apartment with a restless energy that matched the storm inside me. I sat at the edge of my bed, the ring turning over and over between my fingers, my chest aching from the silence that had swallowed us since the fight. Every time I thought of his face that night, the anger in his voice, the way the door slammed like a wall between us, my stomach twisted. I wanted to fix it, but fear had glued me in place. I told myself he didn't care, that maybe it hadn't meant as much to him as it had to me, but the truth pressed against me with every heartbeat. I missed him. I missed his voice, his laugh, his presence filling the room like sunlight. And I couldn't pretend anymore. A soft knock broke through the sound of the rain. My body froze, every nerve on fire. I knew that knock. Hesitant, almost shy, nothing like the confident way he usually moved through the world. My hand shook as I reached for the door, and when I opened it, he stood there, hair damp from running outside, shirt clinging to him in places from the storm. His eyes met mine, and in them was something raw, unguarded, something that stripped me bare. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, breathing hard, as if he had been pacing before working up the courage to come. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice low, rough, the sound of it pulling at every corner of me. "I didn't mean to push you like that. I didn't mean to fight. I don't know what's happening to me." His eyes flicked to the ring still clutched in my hand, then back to me. My throat tightened, and I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. He moved past me slowly, as though afraid I might turn him away, and sat on the edge of my bed with his hands tangled together. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain pounding outside, and then he spoke again, quieter this time. "When I put that ring on, I don't know, it felt like something I wasn't ready to admit. Something I can't stop thinking about." I wanted to say something, but all the words knotted in my chest. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine, desperate, confused, and so heartbreakingly vulnerable. "I don't understand why I feel like this," he continued, voice trembling. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Not like this. And it scares the hell out of me." His confession cracked something inside me wide open. All the walls I had built, all the fear I had carried, melted under the weight of his honesty. I sat down beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his skin, and for the first time, I let my guard slip. "You don't have to understand it right now," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You just have to know you're not alone in it." The words hung between us, fragile but true. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, brushing against mine, and in that small touch, the storm inside me broke. He looked at me with eyes that begged for permission, and before I could think, before fear could stop me, he leaned in. The first kiss was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't soft or delicate, it was urgent, messy, filled with all the confusion and longing we had buried for too long. His lips pressed against mine hard, desperate, as if he was afraid I might pull away. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out the thunder outside. I kissed him back, every ounce of restraint shattering, every fear giving way to the truth I had carried for so long. His hands cupped my face, holding me as though I was something precious, and in that moment, the world disappeared. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, the silence between us was louder than ever, but it wasn't empty anymore. His forehead rested against mine, his breath hot against my skin. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, voice breaking. "I just know I don't want to stop." My chest ached with a mix of relief and terror. Relief because he had finally said the thing I needed to hear, terror because I knew this would change everything that I wanted to freeze that moment, to hold it forever, but life doesn't work that way. We sat there in the quiet, his hands still on my face, my fingers tangled with his, both of us trembling from the weight of what had just happened. The rain outside raged on, but inside, something had shifted. The fight, the silence, the fear, it had all led us here, to this fragile beginning of something neither of us could name but both of us desperately wanted. And as he kissed me again, slower this time, softer, I realized I didn't care about labels or definitions. All I cared about was that, for the first time, he wasn't pulling away. The morning after felt like stepping into a new world, yet everything around us was the same. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee grounds, the couch was still littered with old blankets, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. I moved through the apartment slowly, my body heavy with the memory of his lips, my skin still burning from the way his hands had held me like I was something he had been searching for without knowing it. He sat at the table, his hair messy, a mug of coffee in his hands. He didn't look at me at first, and that silence between us twisted my chest. Part of me feared he would regret everything, that he would brush it off as a mistake, that the fragile thing we had created would crumble before it could take shape. When his eyes finally lifted, they were softer than I expected. He didn't smile, but there was no regret in them either. Just confusion, curiosity, and something warm enough to make me breathe again. "Last night," he started, his voice low and careful, like he was afraid of the words. He trailed off, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. I swallowed hard, the ring heavy on my finger, and waited. "I can't stop thinking about it," he finally admitted. My heart stuttered at his honesty, and for once, I didn't try to hide behind silence. "Neither can I whispered, the words slipping out before fear could stop them. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. It felt like we were standing at the edge of something vast, both terrified to step forward but unable to turn away. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, and muttered, "This is so messed up. I've never been like this. I don't even know what this means about me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and my chest tightened. I could see the weight he was carrying, the confusion, the fear of being judged, the fear of losing who he thought he was. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," I said softly, walking toward him, each step trembling but certain. I placed my hand on the table, close to his, not touching but near enough that the space between us hummed. "You just have to be honest with yourself. With me." He stared at my hand for a long second before sliding his own across the table, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was small, almost hesitant, but it felt like the most important thing in the world that I and the days that followed, our lives quietly shifted into something new. He stopped going out with girls, stopped filling his nights with distractions. Instead, he lingered at home, with me. We cooked dinner together, the silence between us no longer awkward but thick with unspoken closeness. Sometimes his hand would brush against mine as he passed me a plate, and instead of pulling away, he let it linger just long enough for me to notice. Other times, when we sat watching a movie, his shoulder pressed against mine, steady and warm, as if claiming a space he had been afraid to take before. Still, there was tension, his fear against my hope. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened when friends asked why he wasn't dating anymore. I could feel it in the way he avoided public displays of closeness, as if the walls outside our apartment were too dangerous for what we shared. At night, though, when it was just us, his guard broke down. He would sit close, his arm brushing against me, his eyes flicking to my lips as if he wanted to kiss me again but was afraid of what it meant if he did. And then, when the silence grew too heavy, he would finally lean in, and we would kiss again, slower this time, deliberate, a choice rather than a burst of confusion. One night, he confessed something that made my chest ache. "Sometimes I lie awake wondering what people would say if they knew," he whispered, his voice trembling as he traced the edge of the ring with his fingertip. "What my friends would think. My family. If they'd even look at me the same." His eyes were clouded with fear, and I could see how much it tore at him. I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his, and said the only thing I knew to be true. "Love isn't something to be ashamed of. Not ever. What we feel, it's real. And if people can't see that, it's their loss, not ours." He didn't respond right away, but I felt his grip tighten around my hand, as though holding on to me gave him strength. When he kissed me that night, it wasn't rushed or desperate, it was steady, grounding, like he was making a choice to trust what he felt rather than run from it. The ring sat heavy on my finger, catching the dim light, and for the first time, he kissed me while his eyes flicked down to it, as though recognizing it as a symbol of something more than either of us had dared to name, that we were still figuring it out, stumbling in the dark with no clear answers. But with every touch, every look, every whispered word in the quiet of the night, I felt us building something fragile yet unbreakable. He was scared, I was scared, but fear was no longer enough to keep us apart. And as I lay beside him, his breath steady against my skin, I realized that no matter how complicated the world outside might be, inside these walls, I finally felt like I belonged. The weeks that followed felt like living in two different worlds. Inside the apartment, there was a warmth between us that grew stronger every day. It was in the way his hand would find mine when we were alone on the couch, in the way his laughter softened when it was only meant for me, in the way his eyes lingered on me with a quiet tenderness he never showed anyone else. Nights became our sanctuary, filled with whispered conversations that stretched until dawn, his voice low and honest in the dark as he admitted fears he had never voiced before. He would confess how he had never imagined feeling this way, how confusing it was, how freeing it felt, and yet how terrifying at the same time. I would listen, my heart aching but full, reminding him that confusion didn't erase the truth of what we shared, but outside those four walls, the story was different. The world still saw him as the guy everyone knew, the straight roommate, the one who used to flirt with girls at parties, the one who laughed the loudest, who seemed untouchable. His friends noticed the changes, though. They teased him about disappearing, about never joining them for nights out anymore. They joked that he was hiding a secret girlfriend, and I saw the way his shoulders stiffened every time. He would laugh it off, change the subject, but when we got back home, the weight of those words sat heavy on him. He would pace the living room, restless, and I could feel the storm building in him. One evening, we were sitting together eating takeout when his phone buzzed non-stop with messages. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening, and then tossed it aside with a sharp breath. "They don't get it," he muttered. I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head. "They keep asking where I've been, why I don't go out anymore. They don't understand why I'd rather be here." His voice cracked slightly, and he pushed his food away, leaning back in frustration. I reached across the table, letting my fingers brush his hand, but he pulled back before I could hold on. The rejection stung, even though I knew it came from fear, not from me. That night, he finally let the storm out. He stood in the middle of the living room, running his hands through his hair, pacing like he couldn't contain the thoughts eating at him. "What if they find out?" he burst out, his voice loud and raw. "What if they see us together and it ruins everything? What if they never look at me the same again?" His words came fast, tangled with panic, and I just stood there, my chest tight, trying to breathe through the ache his fear created. That I wanted to tell him it didn't matter, that love was worth every risk, but I knew his world wasn't as simple as that. He was someone people admired, someone who had always fit neatly into the expectations everyone had for him. And now, here he was, fighting against a part of himself he had only just begun to understand. I stepped closer, slowly, until I was standing right in front of him. He stopped pacing, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I whispered. "You just have to decide if what we have is worth holding on to." His face softened, but his eyes shone with conflict. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough to face everything else." The words cut through me, sharp and painful, because I knew what he meant. I knew he was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life everyone expected of him and the love that had caught him by surprise. I wanted to beg him to choose us, but I stayed quiet, because the choice had to come from him. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. He still reached for me when no one was around, still kissed me when the world was asleep, still held me like I was the only thing keeping him grounded. But there was a hesitation in him now, a constant war behind his eyes. I could feel it every time his phone buzzed and he ignored it, every time he avoided questions from friends, every time he stared at me like he wanted to say something but swallowed it back instead. One night, lying side by side in the dark, he whispered words that both broke me and gave me hope. "I don't know if I can hide forever," he said, his hand trembling slightly as it traced the ring on my finger. "But I also don't know if I can let you go." His voice was so raw, so vulnerable, that I felt tears sting my eyes. I turned toward him, pressing my forehead against his, and whispered, "Then don't. Just don't let go." He kissed me then, deep and desperate, as though clinging to the only truth he could trust in that moment. And as his arms wrapped around me, I realized that even though fear still shadowed us, love had rooted itself between us in a way that couldn't be undone. He was torn, yes, but he was here, with me, and for now, that was enough. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and golden, and I woke to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor with his hands clasped tightly together. His back was tense, his shoulders stiff, and the silence between us was heavy with something unspoken. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding, because I could feel it. This was the moment he had been running from, the decision he had been circling around for weeks. I wanted to reach for him, to hold him, but something told me to wait, to let him find his own words. He took a long breath before turning to me, his eyes raw with sleeplessness but steady in a way I hadn't seen before. "I can't keep living in pieces," he said quietly, his voice trembling but resolute. "I've been trying to be two different people, one for them, one for me. And I can't anymore. It's breaking me apart." My chest tightened at his words, fear and hope tangling inside me. He swallowed hard and went on, "I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how my friends will react, or my family. But when I think about losing you, that fear feels worse than all of it." His eyes glistened, and his voice cracked as he whispered, "I don't want to lose you. I'd rather face the whole world than give you up." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, and I finally moved, reaching for his hands and holding them tightly. His fingers shook in mine, but he didn't pull away. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine, and for a long time we just stayed there, breathing together, letting the weight of his confession settle between us. That day changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic announcement, there were no grand gestures or sudden declarations to the world, but something inside him shifted. He stopped hiding from me, stopped pulling his hand away when our fingers brushed. In the quiet of our apartment, his affection grew bolder, his kisses less hesitant, his touches surer. And slowly, that courage began to bleed into the world outside. At first, it was small. He didn't lie when his friends asked why he wasn't dating. He didn't laugh off their questions about what had changed. Then one evening, when a friend pushed him too far with a joke about his secret girlfriend, he simply said, "It's not a girlfriend." The silence that followed was heavy, but he didn't flinch, and for the first time I saw him standing firmly in the truth he had been so afraid of. It wasn't easy. There were whispers, questions, and moments when I saw the fear flare up in him again. Some friends pulled away, confused or uncomfortable, while others stayed, their support surprising him in ways that softened his doubts. His family was harder. The conversations were tense, filled with pauses and misunderstandings, but even then, he stood his ground. He didn't have all the answers, didn't even have the right words half the time, but he refused to deny what he felt. And through it all, he kept coming home to me, his eyes tired but his heart steady, as if I was the anchor that reminded him why the struggle was worth it. The ring still sat on my finger, its presence more symbolic now than ever. Sometimes he would take my hand in his and twist it gently, staring at the band with a look that was half fear, half wonder. One night, after a long day that had left him drained, he sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand tightly. He didn't speak for a while, just traced the curve of the ring with his thumb. Then, softly, almost as if he was talking to himself, he said, "I didn't mean to put this on your finger the way I did. I thought it was just a joke, just a moment. But now, every time I see it, I can't stop thinking that maybe it wasn't an accident at all. Maybe it was me admitting what I didn't even know I wanted." I leaned closer, my heart swelling with a quiet ache, and whispered, "Maybe it was always meant to be there." His eyes flicked to mine, shining with unspoken emotions, and he kissed me, slow, deep, with the weight of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. That kiss wasn't desperate or hesitant like before, it was grounding, certain, like a vow. It told me that even if the world outside didn't understand, even if we had to fight for every scrap of acceptance, he wasn't going to let go of me. As the days turned into weeks, our lives began to find a new rhythm. We still faced challenges, still had moments of fear and doubt, but love no longer hid in the shadows. It lived in the way he looked at me across a crowded room, in the way he held my hand a little tighter when people stared, in the way he whispered late at night, "I'm glad it was you." And every time I caught sight of the ring on my finger, I remembered the first time he slipped it on, pretending it was just for size, before kissing me hard and changing both of our lives forever. We weren't perfect, and the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But we had chosen each other, through fear, through confusion, through every unspoken doubt. And that choice, that fragile but powerful choice, was enough to carry us forward.